Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Evie, would you mind putting the first slide up that we can speak to? I'll introduce myself while that's happening. David Miller's my name, from the James Hutton Institute in the United Kingdom. And what I and Mara Cazacu are going to do is introduce you to some of the policy-related findings and some of the emerging recommendations. First of all, at a high level, and then drilling down to some of those emerging at individual case study and national levels.
Okay, thank you, Evie.
I think you can move to the second slide, Evie, that'd be great. So the opening observation is that the findings that are coming through from the empirical data and analysis are showing promise with respect to contributing to the achievement of targets on the global challenges, some of which we heard introduced by Susanna earlier. In climate change, for example, and picking up on some of those mentioned by Andreas barely a few minutes ago, the quantitative evidence from scenarios is indicating promising results on tackling greenhouse gas emissions if some of the practices of agro-ecological farm activities are taken on, but with consequences, with trade-offs to be made and decisions to be made by those actors. In terms of biodiversity, the same is true, but broadly speaking, gains in biodiversity from the quantitative and the qualitative evidence emerging from that modelling. If you could click on that, Evie, please, to bring up the next bullet point. So there are two broad recommendations, which is about mechanisms for inspiring and incentivising changes in farm level practices, and recognising the different levels of governance that are relevant, and enhancing the knowledge and skills through increased access to the tailored advice. And we're going to come back to this, but this refers back also to the comments that you heard in the earlier presentations, and raising awareness and raising finance. And comments have clearly been made in the chat about the significance of the issues to be addressed there. Next slide, please, Evie. Looking more broadly and noting some of the questions which picked up earlier on beyond agriculture, is a key question about social rights and the extent to which the agro-ecological farming systems and farm practices contribute, for instance, to the European Pillar of Social Rights. On farm, with respect to new practices and enhanced standards. Off farm, but local to the system, recognising that all actors have roles and responsibilities in relation to the broader food systems to achieve climate neutrality and reversing biodiversity loss. And in the wider implications, which are potentially global, in terms of reducing dependencies on inputs, the sources of which may raise questions about human rights or labour issues. And in respecting the rights of all actors in transitions that are just, to farming systems that are compatible with delivering on a high-level policy objectives. And key to that is ensuring that no actors are left behind in those transitions, in a similar way to thinking about smart villages and the evolution of rural policy in Europe, that no place is left behind. And the evidence beginning to emerge from that is how the agro-ecological practices and wider thinking can help ensure that is delivered. Next slide, please, Evie. And that takes us to learning and sharing that learning and training. Sustainable Development Goal 4 notes the lifelong learning aspects, as well as education and formal education. And the findings show the significance and importance and value attached to peer-to-peer learning. And actor-led knowledge and innovation, deployment of place-based knowledge that can enhance the benefits of local innovations in their local biophysical and social and economic contexts. And that we look to begin to embed some more of the understanding of agricultural practices and responsibilities in schools. Next bullet point, please, Evie. So here are two general recommendations about embedding those principles and knowledge of practices of agroecology in school curricula and in continuing professional development, so lifelong learning, but also in citizen-focused learning, so that all citizens of all backgrounds, ages, are able to contribute to collective efforts to achieving the broad goals such as climate neutrality and reversing loss of biodiversity. But there is an inherent need to increase the capacity of local actors to be able to create agroecological networks, and the cooperation within schools, public learning, and reaching out to procurement programs from public and private and civil society organizations as well. Next slide, please, Evie. And that takes us to the concept of transdisciplinarity and open science. We heard about how agroecology is a knowledge-rich environment and has knowledge-rich requirements. So the concepts of ensuring that we can bring different perspectives to bear and co-develop the concepts of agroecology, but also the concepts of the platforms within which that can be discussed, instrumental impacts created and building of capacity, is something which has been core to UNISECO. What we're beginning to find are the insights to the cultural differences, the power relationships that apply at different levels in a system, and the significance on practices. And here the question is about how we can broaden the base of understanding and capabilities. Next bullet point, please, Evie. Across all actors, and that's to encourage and operationalize a culture as well as the means of open science to support agroecological farming systems, and to motivate and empower all actors to develop the shared visions for local areas, and monitoring and informing those, for example, but not necessarily exclusively, through citizen science and the sort of visions that are emerging in the EU's long-term vision for rural areas and being explored progressively in the European Open Science Cloud and Strategy for Horizon Europe. And then if we conclude on this part of our presentation with the next slide, it picks up on the topics. Evie, if you don't mind just moving me on to that next slide, on sustainable food systems, about which we've just heard so much from Andreas. And this is about how transformations in production are possible in delivering to the farm to fork, introduced by Susanna, and delivering to Sustainable Development Goal, for instance, 12. And achieving that sustainable management and efficient use can be, but with, again, costs and implications on land, on yields. But our preferences as consumers, as actors in various guises, need to change, and we need to reflect on where the implications are for demand. Next bullet point, please, Evie. And the economic policies slightly redesigned to enable more of a move towards transformation. So the recommendation here is to be thinking about how to link financial support for agroecological farm practices to benefits accrued for human and environmental health, and so deliver cross-cutting benefits in farm to fork and in the appropriate sustainable development goals. With that, I'll pause and hand over to Mara.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Now let's take a quick dive into what is brewing at the national level. Because UNISECO case study teams and multi-actor platforms in the 15 countries represented in the project co-created evidence and strategies to support these transitions to agroecological farming systems, and they formulated policy and practice recommendations that we are now in the process of putting together for publication. I will now just provide a few examples of the policy recommendations that are rooted in the research dilemma of each case study and elaborated around the barriers that the case study has identified in this co-construction iterative process. Let's go to the next slide. Please, Evie. Let's start off with Austria. The research dilemma in the Austrian case study revolved around climate change action through carbon sequestration in the soils on arable lands without putting in peril the other aspects of sustainability, that is social and economic. The issues restraining the adoption or expansion of soil beneficial practices to enhance the humus layer are economic doubts, peer pressure in the sector, insufficient knowledge around soil management amongst both farmers and advisors, poorly targeted incentives in CAP Pillar 1, and the lack of an integrated investment or support strategy in Pillar 2. Adding to that was the issue of poor market access for agro-ecological products, including those stemming from regenerative systems. And so how can the policy framework be improved to overcome these issues? By changes in the curricula of agricultural colleges, developing systemic agroecological advice, equipping the CAP on a European level with the right levers for improved soil management, and developing market channels, including and especially in public procurement. Next slide, please. Moving to a Mediterranean context, the case study in Greece approached the intensive and highly competitive peach farming sector and explored ways in which it could become more sustainable, especially with regards to plant protection, while also increasing the economic competitiveness of farms and their access to market. The key findings point to the need for practical proof and support in the form of advice and peer-to-peer learning, as well as cooperation between farmers and other supply chain actors. So it only follows that policies should promote and strengthen cooperation and information and knowledge exchanges in the value chain and design collective agro-environmental measures. And at the same time, policies should also provide the framework for evidence-based advice focused on novel practices. Next slide, please. In Latvia, the background of the case study are typical organic small dairy farms, which are grassland-based but have a very low productivity. They face problems in the supply chain by not having access to enough organic dairies, having to sell the organic milk to conventional dairies, and getting low prices in return, even lower than for conventional milk. The market is also not very responsive to organic dairy products because of price sensitivities, despite the environmental awareness. So in Latvia, the solution in the policy sphere would be to help put in place cooperatives between organic farmers and organic dairies, to have minimum mandatory share of organic dairy products in public procurement contracts in order to stimulate demand amongst public institutions, and the reduction of VAT for organic products to stimulate consumer uptake. So you can tell from these very different farming contexts around Europe that there are very strong similarities in what they are facing and needing for the adoption or consolidation of agroecological practices. If we zoom out over the entire consortium and all the 15 countries involved, cooperation emerges as one of those common key issues, with 11 countries reporting on it in various forms. It's a matter of both horizontal as well as vertical cooperation, and for a host of different aims, from ensuring volumes and securing sales deals, to better representation in decision fora, to ensure an integrated approach at local or regional level, as it's not enough to change single practices. Another common issue which surfaced is knowledge and advisory services, with 7 countries sensing a very strong need around these critical elements. You also saw in Francesco's presentation earlier that knowledge promotion ranked first on relevance and performance criteria in the assessment of market and policy instruments. The third common issue was processing and adding value to agro-ecological produce for a boost in economic viability and a better position in the value chain. It's fair and necessary to acknowledge the progress that is being made at EU level with the new strategies that are subsequent to the EU Green Deal. All 3 common issues are being targeted by the Farm to Fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy for 2030, but we need to see them implemented and monitored. We need action more than ever. As we all know, we only have a few harvests left. And so to end the presentation, I would invite you to check for more details about these specific examples and the wealth of other policy and practice ideas. Be sure to visit our virtual gallery to do this, to attend the parallel sessions about the case studies, and check out our website and budding agro-ecological knowledge hub, which will be heavily updated and enriched with various papers in the coming months. And yeah, thank you, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Mara, thank you very much. And David, thank you very much. We do have a couple of questions that I just thought I might put out. I think we have time for that. Evie, I think at this point, maybe you could step out. I think the next 2 slides will be presenters will be sharing their own screens. And Mara, I'd love to have you joining me visually. So one of the questions is whether there were any particular instruments that you identified that have the potential to promote agro-ecological transitions. Is that something that is kind of useful for consideration here with your presentation, or it might be useful in for discussion in some of the afternoon sessions?
Well, I think all of the ideas that I shared with regards to policy recommendations can be regarded as policy and market instruments, and these are more detailed in the policy and practice issue briefs that we are putting together and publicating. But we can explore more details about these ideas in the upcoming sessions, in the parallel sessions, which will be very interactive, and we can discuss the details of each case study.
Great. David, you wanted to add in something?
I'll add in just one aspect, which is in relation to land reform, and at least in some of the Scottish context, instruments that support new entrants to access to land for land management, for farming and careers in farming is one way of bringing in potentially new ideas and new motivations. And some of those are, it appears, quite closely linked to principles and cultures closely aligned with agroecology. So I think land reform, tenure, and new entrants would be the sorts of topics which are certainly relevant in answering part of that question.
Yeah, and I think these are some of the questions that are being posed in the chat box, I think are perfect questions to bring to some of the case study sessions, because it really gives that local level insight into some of the questions that are being raised. There's one question I think I will bring here, and then we will move on to the next 2 speakers. So this is from Darko. He comments he likes the recommendation of linking financial support to environmental and health benefits, but says, I assume that a policymaker would question how to operationalize it. So whether this is a question or kind of a comment, you know, how much money might it cost, and how do you actually operationalize those important linkages? If you have any reflections, maybe you could share them here. Otherwise, again, it might be something that we pick up in some of our sessions this afternoon and discussion tomorrow.
So I'll offer one observation, and maybe Maro has other insights from the case studies. I think the observation we'd make here is about thinking of lifestyles. And one thing that was very clear from many of the case studies, indeed, I think from one of the publications that was quoted in the chat, is the positive attitudes and approaches of farmers and those that are taking up or advancing transitions in agro-ecological processes. If that's fair and if that's true, then the observation here would be about linking to positive benefits of well-being rather than avoided costs of illness and bad health, and try to connect the positive narratives of transitions to benefits being gained. Now, that's harder to quantify. It's not really euros per hectare, I fully realize. But nonetheless, I think there's a principle and there's a line of discussion to be explored there that continues to reinforce positive messages about those transitions. And there is evidence of greater involvement in green environments, helping mental well-being and positive spin-offs from that. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Mara, did you want to add anything in?
Yeah, because David's comment sparked my imagination. I was just thinking right now about this whole idea of true cost accounting, where you practically internalize all of the external consequences of the practices that you use in farming. So, for example, the environmental impact and the health impacts that would be integrated into the price, the market price of the goods that you are putting on the market. But the more straightforward reflection that I had when you brought that comment up into the discussion, Kate, was ACIs. For example, in our case in Romania, ACIs will be of crucial value in order to operationalize this knowledge transfer and exchange across the various stakeholders and the entities which can provide inputs into how policies should be designed and how they could be monitored. For example, in our case, we highlighted that it's critical that in this future ACI system, ecologists and health experts should be integrated in order to enable this. And we can explore that idea more in our case study session.
Great. I'd like to thank the two of you for your contributions, both presentation as well as engaging with some of the questions. And I can already see that there's a continued chat in the stage in response to some of what you've been talking about.